She had burns all over her body. Not bruises from a fall, not a scrape from a stumble. Burns the kind that are made when something lit is pressed deliberately against skin and held there until the body stops resisting. She was 10 years old and the burns were just the beginning of the inventory. She was missing most of her toenails, not chipped, not damaged, missing, as if they had been torn or worn away across time. Clumps of hair were gone from her scalp in patches. She had 2 black eyes, both of them, swollen and dark against the pallor of a face that was already beginning to look like it had given up. She was malnourished, starved, in the clinical sense, her small body having been deprived of adequate food long enough that it was visible in the structure of her. Her skin was mapped in bruises from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. Not one bruise, not several. A covering of bruises so comprehensive that the word the first doctors who examined her used was not a medical term. It was a human one. They called it torture. And then there was the brain hemorrhage. Blood pooling inside her skull, pressing against the tissue of her brain, doing damage that could not be undone regardless of what happened next. She was unconscious when emergency responders found her. She was barely breathing. She was 10 years old and she was found alone on a dirt road in Apache County, Arizona, on the morning of July 27, 2025, as if she had simply been left there. The 911 call that brought officers to that road had come from a woman named Anicia Woods. Woods told the dispatcher that Rebekah had run away from their campsite and that a neighbor who had happened to be nearby, who had happened to find her, who had happened to know whose child she was, had found her on the roadside and called the family. When officers arrived, Rebekah's father, Richard Baptiste, was also there. The first thing investigators needed was the name and contact information for this neighbor. Who were they? Where did they live? How had they located a child from a private campsite miles away, identified her, known to contact the family rather than emergency services, and then vanished before first responders arrived? Richard Baptiste could not name them. He could not describe where they lived. He could not provide a single piece of identifying information for the person who had allegedly found his dying daughter, and then apparently disappeared the moment the authorities showed up. The neighbor did not exist. What the officers had in front of them was a 10-year-old child with burns and missing toenails, and a brain hemorrhage and bruises on every surface of her body in multiple stages of healing, meaning days and weeks of accumulation. Not a single event, and 2 adults standing beside her who had called 911, and then could not explain the most basic element of the story they had told. And the detail that doctors at the nearest hospital, the little Colorado Medical Center in Winslow, would later add to the record was this: given the severity of Rebekah's injuries, her condition of malnourishment, and the state of her body when she arrived, the medical staff did not believe she was physically capable of having run away at all. She had not run away, she had been left there. Her name was Rebekah Baptiste. She was 10 years old. She died 3 days later on July 30, 2025 at Phoenix Children's Hospital, nearly 200 miles from where she was found. And before any of this, she had done everything a child is capable of doing to ask for help. She had screamed into every system that was supposed to hear her. She had jumped from a second-story window barefoot to get to someone who might listen. She had run to strangers. She had told police officers, doctors, school staff, anyone who would look at her, what was happening in her home. 12 times, her school alone had contacted the Arizona Department of Child Safety on her behalf. 19 times across all sources, the people responsible for protecting her had been formally alerted that something was wrong. And at the end of all of it, she was left on a dirt road in the desert. This is her story. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what was there to begin with. Rebekah Baptiste attended Empower College Prep, a school in Phoenix, Arizona, and in another life, the life she deserved, she would have been exactly the kind of student that makes educators feel like their work matters. She was bright. She was perceptive in the particular way that children who have learned to read their environment very carefully tend to be: watchful, alert, always slightly ahead of whatever was being said out loud in the room. Teachers noticed her. Not because she was a behavioral challenge or a discipline concern, but because she had a way of being present that made the adults around her pay attention, and because underneath the alertness there was always something that felt like worry. The specific, low-grade, quiet worry of a child who has never fully been able to relax. Her teachers Penny Roubison and Phoenicia Swally knew her. They had relationships with her. They were among the people who would stand up and speak at her memorial service after she died, because she was not an abstraction to them. She was a child they had watched walk through their doors every morning and whose situation they had worried about in the particular way that teachers worry, helplessly, persistently, from behind the limits of what their role allows them to do. They could report. They could document. They could call. They could try to make sure that the right people had the right information. They did all of those things repeatedly across multiple years, and when Rebekah died, they were among the people who had to live with knowing they had tried and it had not been enough. The school's social services staff saw the same things the teachers saw, and they documented them with the specific vocabulary of mandatory reporters. Marks on the children that aligned with disclosures that then evaporated the following morning, children who told the truth in the relative safety of a school hallway, and then came back the next day with a different story. Court documents would later describe this pattern explicitly, noting that the Baptiste children would often later change their stories to protect their parents. That phrasing, to protect their parents, is the legal framing. The lived experience of it is something more specific. Children who had learned, through the direct experience of consequences, that telling the truth at school produced worse outcomes at home. Every retraction was not confusion. Every walked-back disclosure was not a child being unreliable. It was a child doing the math on what it cost to tell the truth and deciding that the cost was too high. Rebekah had a grandmother, Sandra Hawkins, who was a constant in her life and who would speak at her memorial service. She had a mother, Sandy Hawkins, whose relationship to Rebekah's custody had been shaped not by her own choices, but by the decisions of the child welfare and family court systems that had placed Rebekah in her father's care rather than hers. The separation between Sandy Hawkins and her daughter across the years before Rebekah's death was one of the most painful dimensions of a case that had many painful dimensions. A mother who loved her child and had been navigating a bureaucratic and legal maze to try to stay close to her, while the system that was supposedly managing the situation was failing the child at every level. After Rebekah died, Sandy Hawkins filed a civil lawsuit against the Arizona Department of Child Safety and became one of the most vocal public advocates for accountability in this case. She did not disappear when the cameras turned elsewhere. She kept pushing. Rebekah's uncle, speaking to media after her death, described being shown photographs of his niece's condition when she was found on that road. He said she was black and blue from her head to her toes. He said she had 2 black eyes. He said that looking at those images, knowing they were images of his sister's child, a child he had known, a child the whole family had known and loved, was something no person should ever have to experience. He said Rebekah had been taken from this world in a very gruesome and horrible way. There was nothing in what he said that was hyperbole. He was describing exactly what the medical records confirmed. Rebekah had also experienced things that the adults around her had noted before any of this came to its worst end. Court documents describe the Baptiste children reporting various forms of punishment at home, running laps with little to no water, being forced to hold plank positions, being struck with belts. One of Rebekah's younger siblings, during their interview with investigators following her death, said she got hit, she got hit a lot. A child describing the daily reality of their siblings' existence in language that is precise and simple and completely unbearable. She got hit. She always got hit. She got hit a lot. There was a version of Rebekah's life in which none of this happened. A version where she went to school and came home to a safe house and did her homework and ate dinner with people who were glad she was there. That version existed for other children in her class. It did not exist for her. But what did exist, what was real and documented and undeniable, was that she fought for it. Persistently, repeatedly, at great personal cost, against enormous odds, she kept fighting to reach someone who would help. That is who Rebekah Baptiste was, and that is what this story is about. The documented history of Richard Baptiste and the Arizona Department of Child Safety begins on August 29, 2015, when Rebekah was a few months old. That first report to DCS raised concerns about her living conditions and alleged drug use by her parents. According to records reviewed by ABC 15 and other outlets, that initial case was never formally closed, a detail that would become emblematic of a pattern of administrative incompleteness that runs through this entire case like a thread. The case was opened. It was never shut. And in the years that followed, new reports were filed into a system that already had an open record on this family, a record that in theory should have provided accumulating context to every investigator who touched it, and in practice often did not. The second documented DCS report came on May 6, 2016. Rebekah was approximately a year old. The report noted that she had a diaper rash and an untreated ear infection. These are not dramatic injuries. They are not the kind of thing that produces a headline, but they represent something specific. A child under 2 years old with medical conditions that were both preventable and painful being left without care by the adults responsible for her. An ear infection in an infant is not a minor oversight. It is painful, it can cause lasting damage if untreated, and it requires an adult to notice, to act, and to take that child to a doctor. None of those things happened. DCS noted it, and life continued. In August 2018, Phoenix police made their first recorded welfare check visit to the family's apartment. By March 14, 2019, the situation had reached a threshold that resulted in action. DCS received a report of neglect involving Rebekah and her 2 younger brothers, alongside allegations of maternal drug use during pregnancy. All 3 children were removed from the home and placed in out-of-home care. Rebekah was approximately 4 years old. Her brothers were younger still. The removal that March would keep them out of the family home for the next 5 years. 5 years during which the state of Arizona was responsible for these children, and Richard Baptiste was living without them. During those same 5 years, the picture of who Richard Baptiste was as a parent continued to develop in the records. On July 26, 2021, DCS received a report regarding a newborn, a child Richard had fathered with another woman, while Rebekah and her brothers were still in foster care. The investigation that followed that report led to Richard voluntarily surrendering his parental rights over that child, who was then placed in foster care. This is a significant and underreported detail in the public narrative of this case. By the time Rebekah was returned to his custody in January 2024, Richard Baptiste had accumulated a child welfare record that spanned a decade and involved multiple children across multiple households, and every single one of those children had been removed from his care. He had not kept any of them. The one he had voluntarily given up parental rights to was the most direct possible expression of a man who had demonstrated, across years and institutions, that he was incapable of providing the basic conditions of safety that children require. The legal and systemic question of why Rebekah was returned to him in January 2024, given this history, given the open case that technically dated to 2015, given the pattern across multiple children, is one that the DCS internal review and subsequent investigations have begun to address without ever fully answering. Child welfare law in Arizona, as in most states, is built around the principle of family reunification. The presumption, legally and operationally, is that children should be returned to their biological parents when possible. That presumption has genuine value when applied carefully. It was not applied carefully here. What is known is that on January 30, 2024, Rebekah Baptiste was returned to her father's custody. She was 9 years old. She had spent roughly half her entire life in the care of the state, removed from this household because of what the state had documented about it. And she was being sent back to her father, and now to his girlfriend, a woman named Anicia Woods, who had not been part of Rebekah's life before and who had, as the record would show, already been the subject of at least one abuse report even before Rebekah's return. The date of the return is January 30, 2024, and according to DCS records, a report of neglect was also filed on that same date, the very day Rebekah came home. The system returned her to the household and simultaneously recorded a concern about the household. That coincidence of timing is not irony. It is a summary of everything that followed. Anicia Woods was 29 years old at the time she and Richard Baptiste were charged with first-degree murder in the death of Rebekah Baptiste. She is referred to in court filings and media reports as Rebekah's stepmother, though the relationship was never legally formalized. She was Richard Baptiste's girlfriend, and by the time of Rebekah's death, his fiancée. And she was something else, too, something that adds a particular and disturbing dimension to her alleged role in what happened to Rebekah. Court TV reporting identified Anicia Woods as a former nurse. She had professional training in medical assessment. She had been educated specifically in the recognition, treatment, and documentation of physical injury to the human body. Whatever gap might be extended in law or in human understanding to a layperson who failed to recognize signs of serious ongoing abuse in a child, it cannot be extended in the same way to someone who had been trained to look at bodies and know what they were seeing. The documented reports involving Anicia Woods begin before Rebekah even officially returned to the household. On November 2, 2023, while Rebekah was still in foster care and the return to her father's custody was being arranged, DCS received a report alleging that a child in Richard Baptiste's home had been scratched on the neck by Woods. An investigation was conducted. DCS found no supporting evidence. The case was closed. In December 2023, police conducted a welfare check at the family's Phoenix apartment. Then, on February 13, 2024, just weeks after Rebekah's return, another report came in. A child in the home had been scratched on the neck, again attributed to Anicia Woods. And on September 13, 2024, a third report described another scratched neck and a bump on the head of a child in the household. Look at that pattern carefully, because it matters. 3 separate DCS reports across 3 separate occasions, all describing similar physical injuries on children in the same household, all attributed to the same adult. That is not a pattern that reasonable interpretation can explain away as coincidence or fabrication. When the same type of injury is reported on children in the same home, attributed to the same person, across multiple distinct points in time, the most credible interpretation is not that all 3 reports are wrong. The most credible interpretation is that the reports are describing a reality, that something was happening in that household with enough consistency to show up repeatedly in the records. Each of those 3 reports was investigated. None was substantiated. Each was closed. There is also a detail in the Wikipedia documentation of this case that has not received the attention it deserves in the broader public narrative. During at least one of the police visits to the family's Phoenix apartment in this period, officers recorded evidence of possible SA of a minor. That documentation existed in the record. It was not acted on in a way that produced charges or a formal intervention at the time, but it was written down. It was part of the accumulating history of this family that any investigator reviewing the full file should have been able to see. Based on what we know about how DCS managed information across agencies in this case, a gap the department itself later identified as one of its key systemic failures, The question of whether any single investigator ever had access to that documentation, alongside everything else in the record, is a question the DCS review has not publicly answered with clarity. The body cam footage released by the Holbrook Police Department from the morning of July 27, 2025, shows Anicia Woods on the roadside after 911 was called. Body language expert Susan Constantine, who analyzed the footage at the request of Fox 10 Phoenix, described specific behaviors she found notable. Woods was running to each arriving officer in turn, telling lengthy stories with details that had no direct relevance to Rebekah's condition or location, including, at one point, telling officers she can't be trusted in the building, there's weapons, there's knives. She was talking voluminously, urgently, to anyone who would listen about everything except the critical condition of the child lying on the road. Constantine also commented on Richard Baptiste's behavior in the footage. He never said Rebekah's name. He referred to her as it. Constantine noted that in statement analysis, that kind of linguistic distancing from a parent referring to a dying child is something that investigators pay close attention to. It does not tell you definitively what someone did, but it tells you something about how a person relates to the subject of their words. He didn't say his daughter's name. He said, "It's mine." 12. That is the number of times staff at Empower College Prep contacted the Arizona Department of Child Safety about Rebekah Baptiste and her family before her death. 12 calls from mandatory reporters. From people who are legally required to report suspected abuse and who, by the nature of their daily work, were seeing this child in person, watching her walk through doors, checking her expression, noticing changes in her physical condition, hearing what she said, and then hearing what she said the next day when the story changed. 12 contacts from people who knew her and were using every tool available to them to get someone to act. When the story of Rebekah's death became public, DCS disputed the number. The department initially said their records showed only 5 hotline calls from Empower College Prep. The school stood firm. Their documentation showed 12. It took the pressure of a publicly ordered investigation, one called for by Governor Hobbs herself, and sustained investigative journalism from ABC 15, for DCS to release documentation confirming 7 additional contacts that their initial public statement had not included. The corrected number, 12, consistent with what the school had said from the beginning. Let that sit for a moment. Not just the 12 reports, though those matter enormously. What matters here is the specific nature of the discrepancy. DCS, the agency responsible for protecting children in Arizona, when asked directly how many times a school had reported concerns about a murdered child, initially provided a number that was less than half the actual documented total. The undercounting was not revealed by the agency proactively. It was revealed only after external pressure, public scrutiny, and an investigation ordered by the state's governor. And then, quietly, the records were released, and the number moved from 5 to 12. The implication of that discrepancy, not as an accusation, but as a documented fact, is that the department's own internal records were not being consistently maintained, reviewed, or counted, at the very moment when the accuracy of those records mattered most. The 12 calls from the school were not the entirety of the contact history. A notice of claim filed on behalf of Rebekah's mother, Sandy Hawkins, reviewed by Fox 10 Phoenix, included a chart documenting 19 separate occasions across the full history of the case when DCS had been alerted to potential abuse or neglect in the household. 19 documented instances across multiple years, multiple agencies, multiple reporters. The notice of claim also alleged that DCS had not properly classified reports and had declined to remove Baptiste or her 2 younger brothers from the home, despite the accumulating record. 19 times. Consider what each of those 19 contacts represents. A person somewhere decided that what they were seeing or hearing was serious enough to formally report it. They made the call. They did the thing that the system asks citizens and professionals to do when they believe a child is in danger. And 19 times, Rebekah was still in that home when the contact was over. The school's social services staff described a pattern that is deeply familiar to anyone who has worked closely with families where abuse is ongoing. Rebekah and her siblings would arrive with marks on their bodies. They would tell a staff member what happened. The staff member would document it and call DCS. And then the next day, the children would come back with a different account. They had fallen. They didn't remember. Nothing had happened. In court documents, prosecutors specifically noted that the Baptiste children often changed their stories to protect their parents. But that framing, protect their parents, requires unpacking. Children in households where abuse is normalized and where the consequences of disclosure are severe do not retract their stories because they feel protective of their abusers in the way that adults feel protective of people they love. They retract their stories because they have been taught, through direct experience, that not retracting has consequences that are worse than retracting. Every recantation was not a child being unreliable. Every recantation was a child signaling the precise amount of danger they were in. The DCS hotline staff, responding to reports filtered through mandatory reporting chains rather than coming directly from the people who had observed the injuries or heard the disclosures, were making assessments based on second-hand information that had already been compressed and summarized before it reached them. The direct accounts, the teacher who saw the marks, the social worker who heard what Rebekah said before she changed her story, were not the voices at the end of the phone line. They were layers removed from it, and in that distance, critical context was repeatedly lost. On October 17, 2024, Rebekah Baptiste was 9 years old, and she made a decision that tells you everything you need to know about the conditions inside the apartment she was living in. She went to a second-floor window, she was barefoot, and she jumped. The events leading to the jump are documented in the police report obtained and published by ABC 15. Anicia Woods had accused Rebekah of pretending to be asleep. As punishment, Rebekah was made to run laps. She was also struck. Rebekah told officers that Woods had hit her with a brush on the backs of her hands and with both a brush and a belt on her feet. The responding officer documented what he could see: faint bruising and marks on the back of both of Rebekah's hands and bruising and red marks on both of her feet. These were not catastrophic injuries. They were marks, the kind that could be minimized, explained away, attributed to other causes by a determined adult with a plausible story. But they were consistent with exactly what Rebekah had described. The marks matched the story. The decision Rebekah made that day to go to the window on the second floor and jump was not an impulsive moment of panic. Or even if it was a panic that was grounded in a very clear assessment of options. The window was dangerous. The ground was far away for a 9-year-old child. Jumping meant injury and uncertainty and an unknown outcome. But staying was worse. She had run the math on her available choices and decided that the outside, the unknown, the physical danger of a 2-story drop, was safer than the inside of that apartment. She jumped barefoot and she hit the ground and she kept moving. Before she made it to the gas station, she approached a homeless person on the street and asked them for help. That single detail contains a volume of information about how frightened she was and how clearly she understood that she needed an adult. She did not have a phone. She did not have shoes. She was a child who had just fallen from a second floor and landed on hard ground and gotten up and kept running, and the first person she found, she asked for help. When that didn't produce what she needed, she kept going. She found a QT, a gas station and convenience store, and she found the clerk behind the counter and she told him what was happening to her. Court documents would later record the words Rebekah used. She ran to the QT and said that her stepmother was abusing her, hitting her hands and her legs. She was specific. She named the person. She named the action. She named where on her body it had happened. She said it with enough clarity and urgency that the clerk called 911 without hesitation. Officers responded. Rebekah was taken to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where she was treated for a bloody lip and bruises on her wrists and feet. Medical staff examined her. Police interviewed her. She told them what she had told the clerk. She told them it had happened a lot. She showed them the marks on her hands and feet that the officer documented as consistent with her account. And then, because the system requires it, investigators also went back to the apartment and spoke to Richard Baptiste and Anicia Woods. The two adults told investigators the injuries were self-inflicted. Rebekah, they said, had done this to herself. The investigating detective was not the last line of defense. The case went to DCS, which opened an investigation. The investigation concluded on November 18, 2024, approximately 1 month after Rebekah jumped from that window. The determination: no evidence of present or future danger. Phoenix police investigated allegations of child abuse and neglect and also brought no charges. The self-inflicted explanation was accepted. The case was closed. And Rebekah was sent home. There is no interpretive framing that makes that outcome reasonable. This was not a close call where the evidence was ambiguous. A 9-year-old child jumped from a second-story building, barefoot, landed hard enough to produce a bloody lip, ran through the street asking strangers for help, found a gas station, told the clerk she was being abused, was taken to a hospital, had her injuries documented by a medical team, told police officers specifically and coherently what had been done to her and by whom, and was returned to the people she had been running from because those people said her injuries were self-inflicted. The weight of every available piece of evidence in that situation pointed in one direction. The formal determination pointed in the other. 9 months later, she was dead. In January 2025, specifically January 18, another DCS report alleged that Richard was forcing Rebekah to run as punishment without allowing her water breaks in the Arizona winter heat. It was documented. Police returned to the apartment again in April. On May 19, 2025, the last DCS report concerning Rebekah before her death was filed, alleging physical punishment. By that point, when DCS went to follow up, they could not reach the family. The phone number on file produced no response. The address on file produced no one. The family had moved and they had not told anyone where they were going. At the beginning of July 2025, confirmed through court documents and reporting from ABC 15 and the official DCS Fatality Summary Report, Richard Baptiste and Anicia Woods relocated their family from their Phoenix apartment to a remote campsite near the small community of Concho in Apache County, Arizona. They packed up and left the city. They took Rebekah and her 2 younger brothers with them. And they moved into a yurt, a round, portable, semi-permanent structure, on land in one of the most sparsely populated counties in the United States. The site had no running water, no electricity, no infrastructure that would naturally bring any outside person to their door. The nearest neighbors were not close. The nearest town with any real services was a significant distance away on roads that vary from 2-lane highway to unmarked dirt. Apache County is genuinely remote in a way that people who have not seen that part of the American Southwest sometimes underestimate. This is not rural in the casual sense of the word. This is the kind of country where the silence is total, where the landscape extends to every horizon without interruption, where if you needed help and didn't have a phone or a vehicle, you would have no immediate path to it. Moving a family of 5, 3 of whom were children, one of whom was a 10-year-old who had already twice attempted to run away from the previous home, to a location like this, without utilities, in the first week of July in Arizona, was not a neutral choice. The timing matters. An active DCS investigation had been opened following the May 19 report. DCS was attempting to follow up. They could not reach the family. The move to the Concho campsite was the reason they could not reach them. There is no confirmed address, no registered location, No utility account that would put this family anywhere on the grid of agencies that were supposed to be monitoring them. They had removed themselves, cleanly and completely, from any context in which an investigation could reach them. Whether or not that removal was deliberate, and given everything that preceded and followed it, most reasonable observers looking at the totality of this case would conclude that it was, the effect was the same. DCS was trying to investigate a family, and the family had made itself unreachable. Inside the yurt, in the July heat of eastern Arizona, without running water and without electricity, the abuse that had been producing reports since the children returned to Richard's care in January 2024 was continuing. The younger brothers would later tell investigators their parents hit them a lot and that they were not supposed to tell anyone. The punishment documented in earlier court filings, running laps without water, holding plank positions, being struck with a belt, appears to have continued in this environment, away from any teacher who might notice, any neighbor who might hear through an apartment wall, any school social worker who might document something and make a call. The specific physical protections that come from a child being around people outside their immediate household were gone. There was no one to see. There was no one to hear. There was no one to call. Rebekah tried to leave on July 9. She was brought back. She tried again on July 12. She was brought back again. 2 attempts in 3 weeks in the July desert, without shoes, without a phone, without a road immediately accessible, miles from any town. 2 times she looked at the open desert and decided it was safer than the yurt. 2 times the adults she was trying to escape retrieved her and brought her back. And then they stayed. And the campsite remained where it was, and the weeks continued, and no one outside came. The last time Rebekah ran was July 27. The 911 call came in the morning. It was Anicia Woods on the line. She told the dispatcher that Rebekah had run away from the campsite and that a neighbor had found her unconscious on a dirt road near the intersection of State Route 77 and U.S. Route 180 near Hallbrook. When officers arrived at the scene, officers from the Hallbrook Police Department, whose body cam footage would later be released to the public, Richard Baptiste was standing there too. The first questions were about the neighbor. Who was this person? What was their name? Where did they live? How had they found a child from a private campsite and identified who she was and known to contact the family? Why weren't they here now? Richard Baptiste could not answer any of those questions. He could not name the neighbor. He could not say where they lived. He could not describe them with any specificity. He could not explain their absence. The neighbor, investigators would ultimately conclude, was a fabrication. There was no neighbor. There was no finding. Rebekah had not run away. She had been left there. On the body cam footage, the behavior of both adults was later analyzed by body language expert Susan Constantine at the request of Fox 10 Phoenix. Constantine noted that Richard Baptiste never said Rebekah's name. He referred to her only as "It's mine," he said when speaking to officers about the child who was unconscious on the ground. Constantine observed that this kind of linguistic distancing, particularly in a moment of supposed parental crisis, is something that trained analysts treat as meaningful. It does not constitute proof of anything. But in statement analysis, the way a person talks about a subject, the name they use, the words they choose, the distance they put between themselves and the subject in their language, carries information. Richard Baptiste, standing beside his dying daughter on a dirt road in Apache County, did not say her name. Anicia Woods, by contrast, was talking to everyone. She ran to each arriving officer in turn and launched into detailed accounts that were notable primarily for what they did not cover. She told officers at one point, "She can't be trusted in the building. There's weapons, there's knives." She gave lengthy statements about details unrelated to Rebekah's immediate medical emergency. She was producing noise, volume, movement. Narrative in a situation where the only relevant fact was the condition of the child on the ground. Constantine noted this in her public analysis. A person genuinely panicked about a child they had been trying to help is not typically running from officer to officer constructing explanations. They are focused on the child. What first responders found when they assessed Rebekah was the full inventory of what had been done to her. The brain hemorrhage, the spinal fracture, the bruising across her entire body head to toe, the burns consistent with a lit cigarette pressed against skin, the missing toenails, the missing patches of scalp hair, the malnourishment, the dehydration, the injuries in multiple stages of healing, days and weeks accumulated. She was unconscious. She was barely breathing. She was transported first to the little Colorado Medical Center in Winslow, where doctors assessed her condition and made a finding that went directly into the investigative record. Given the severity of her injuries and the extent of her physical deterioration, they did not believe she was physically capable of having run away. The story that had been told she ran, a neighbor found her, was medically inconsistent with the state of the child they were examining. She was transferred by air to Phoenix Children's Hospital. While Rebekah was in transit, investigators arrived at the campsite. What they found confirmed what her body had been telling them. On the floor of the yurt, animal feces and trash. In the trash container, bloodied paper towels and clumps of hair. On a hairbrush at the scene, blood and blonde hair. And critically, the clothing worn by both adults had been changed before the 911 call was made. Investigators found evidence that the clothing they had been wearing prior to the call had been replaced. That decision, to change clothes before calling for help for a dying child, is one of the details in this case that requires no interpretive framing. The changing of clothing before a 911 call, when blood and hair are found in the trash and on a hairbrush in the same space, is not the behavior of adults responding to a crisis. It is the behavior of adults managing evidence. Back at the scene, Richard Baptiste was shown photographs of his daughter's injuries from Phoenix Children's Hospital. He expressed no emotion. The detective present noted this in the probable cause affidavit specifically, writing that it would have been essentially impossible for a parent to look at those photographs without reacting. The images were described as horrendous. Richard Baptiste looked at them and said nothing. Later in their interviews, both Richard and Anicia admitted to using a belt as a form of punishment. Richard admitted to using excessive force, according to a Navajo County Sheriff's report reviewed by Court TV. In those same interviews, detectives noted that the couple described multiple prior instances of Rebekah running away, including the October 2024 window jump and a separate incident at a Phoenix gas station. They framed these escapes as behavioral problems requiring correction. The correction, as they described it, involved a belt. Rebekah had jumped from a window to escape the consequences of a previous escape, and their response to that was to increase the severity of the punishment. A child who ran away was hit harder. A child who kept running away was moved to the desert and hit harder still. Rebekah's two younger brothers were interviewed on July 28. They confirmed that their parents hit them a lot. They confirmed that they had been told not to tell anyone. Phoenix Children's Hospital is one of the premier pediatric medical facilities in the United States. Its staff have managed some of the most complex and critical pediatric trauma cases in the country, and they have seen things that the majority of the world will never have to see. When Rebekah arrived, the team that received her brought everything they had to bear on her situation. They were working against a brain hemorrhage, a spinal fracture, severe dehydration, malnourishment, and the cumulative physical damage of injuries sustained over weeks. Any one of those conditions is serious. Together, in a 10-year-old child who had been denied adequate food and water in the July Arizona heat, they created a medical picture that the attending doctor, identified in court documents as Dr. Hubbard, described in the clearest possible clinical terms. At the preliminary hearing, Deputy Sheriff Cole Soderquist read from Dr. Hubbard's findings. The doctor stated that his findings were consistent with child abuse, child SA, and torture. That word, torture, did not come from a lawyer or a family member or a journalist. It came from a physician who had examined Rebekah's injuries and applied his medical training to the task of describing what he was seeing. It is the word that medical science produced when confronted with the documentation of what had been done to a 10-year-old girl over the weeks and months she had spent in that yurt in Apache County. The injuries to Rebekah's vaginal and anal region, documented during her medical examination at Phoenix Children's Hospital, were cited by prosecutor Lassie Collins at the preliminary hearing as evidence of SA. Those findings provided the basis for molestation charges added to the original criminal complaint. The charges were filed against both Richard Baptiste and Anicia Woods, relating to two separate children, a detail that suggests the evidence gathered during the medical examinations of the Baptiste children was not limited to Rebekah alone. Deputy Soderquist testified that the children had gone through examinations and that at the time of the hearing, some test results were still outstanding. The preliminary hearing was held on September 4, 2025, in Apache County. It ran for 3 hours. The state presented 95 pieces of evidence: photographs from Phoenix Children's Hospital, physical evidence from the campsite, prior DCS contact documentation, and the testimony of the case agent. A judge found probable cause to charge both Richard Baptiste and Anicia Woods with first-degree murder, multiple counts of child abuse, and 2 counts of molestation of a child each. The defense used its cross-examination time to focus primarily on the absence of an official cause of death. Rebekah's autopsy results and official cause of death have not been publicly released, and to ask detailed questions about the specifics of her injuries and statements made by individuals described as neighbors of the campsite. The judge found the state's evidence sufficient on all 5 charges and moved the case forward. On September 8, 2025, Richard Baptiste and Anicia Woods entered not guilty pleas in Apache County Superior Court. On September 22, the judge ruled they would be tried together, as the prosecution had sought. Bail was set at $1 million each, which effectively ensured both would remain in custody until trial. The trial is scheduled to begin on June 2, 2026. Rebekah's 2 younger brothers were removed from the family's custody and placed in protective care following her death. And on July 30, 2025, 3 days after she was found on that dirt road in Apache County, after 3 days during which a team of doctors fought to undo what had been done to her across the weeks and months she had spent in that household, Rebekah Baptiste died at Phoenix Children's Hospital. She was 10 years old. She had been fighting to be saved for the last year of her life. She had used every avenue available to a child without resources, without a phone, without anyone in her immediate household who would help her, to reach someone who could. And at the end of all of it, she ran out of time. Governor Katie Hobbs publicly ordered a DCS investigation into the handling of Rebekah's case in August 2025. The announcement came under enormous public pressure and amid intense journalistic scrutiny, following the revelation that a child who had been known to DCS since infancy, flagged at least 19 times across all documented sources, with 12 of those contacts coming from the same school, had died in the care of the very parent the state's own system had returned her to. DCS Director Catherine Tax said in a statement that she had questions about the case and that the entire file was under review. That was in August. The internal review took several months. In December 2025, DCS identified and provided to ABC 15 what the department called the key issues in Rebekah's case. There were 5 of them, and each one deserves to be understood not as an isolated departmental quirk, but as a structural reality of how child welfare systems across this country operate, or fail to. The first issue was incomplete information from hotline callers. DCS's own language was direct on this point. Mandatory reporter workplaces, schools, hospitals, daycares typically require a designated staff member to make hotline calls, not necessarily the person who actually witnessed the injury or received the disclosure. That means the person making the report is often telling someone at DCS what they were told by someone else who saw something. Every step in that chain compresses and potentially distorts the specificity of the original account. The teacher who saw the mark on Rebekah's hand may have reported it to the school's designated contact. The designated contact then called DCS and described what the teacher described. By the time it reached the hotline caseworker who opened the file, the account had already passed through at least one remove from direct observation. And in that remove, critical specificity, the exact nature of the mark, the child's specific words, the visible distress that a person in the room could see, may not fully survive the transmission. In Rebekah's case, where the school called 12 times and DCS initially recorded only 5 of those contacts, this problem was not theoretical, it was documented. The second issue identified was turnover and workload. The DCS statement on this was unusually candid. High turnover, low pay, intense caseloads overwhelmed supervisors. Workers, both new and veteran, feeling unsupported. Departing staff leaving behind incomplete documentation that creates inefficiencies for whoever inherits the cases. Judges and attorneys holding new specialists accountable for problems inherited from the workers who came before them. Negative public attention creating pressure to close cases quickly, sometimes at the expense of quality. That last phrase is perhaps the most important one in the entire DCS review: pressure to close cases quickly, sometimes at the expense of quality. In a system where workers are overloaded and under-resourced, the resolution of a case, any resolution, can become the goal rather than the correct resolution. A closed case is a removed burden. A case closed prematurely on the family of Rebekah Baptiste because the adults gave a plausible explanation and the worker had 12 other open files, is a child sent back to the people hurting her. The third issue was the challenge of engaging a parent's significant other. DCS identified this as a structural gap in its legal authority. Significant others who are not biological parents can decline to participate in DCS services, and courts cannot mandate their participation. As a result, investigations tend to focus on the biological parent and have limited tools to evaluate or address the role of the non-parent household member. In Rebekah's case, the person whose name appeared most consistently in the abuse allegations, Anicia Woods, was precisely this kind of household member. She was not Rebekah's parent. She could not be compelled to participate in services. The department's formal tools for assessing and addressing her role in the household were limited by this structural reality. A woman who was a former nurse, who had been named in 3 separate DCS reports before Rebekah's death, who police had already made contact with multiple times in connection with concerns about the children, had a legal buffer between her and the investigative process that she never had to work hard to maintain. The fourth issue identified was the strained relationship between DCS and the legal and judicial system. The department cited differing priorities, communication challenges, the effects of frequent program changes, and the shift to virtual court hearings since the COVID-19 pandemic as factors that impaired coordination. When a child's safety depends on multiple agencies functioning in concert, DCS, law enforcement, the courts, schools, medical providers, and those agencies are operating with communication gaps, procedural misalignments, and inconsistent information sharing, children fall through the spaces between them. In Rebekah's case, DCS had contacts. Phoenix Police had contacts. The school had contacts. But at no point, it appears, did any single decision-maker have access to the full, integrated picture of everything that was known about this family from every source simultaneously. Each agency was working from its own partial record, and the sum of those partial records, the 19 contacts, the pattern of reported injuries, the October window escape, the body cam footage, the prior SA evidence noted by police, was never assembled in one place for any one person to see. The fifth issue was staff reliance on prior interactions. DCS identified this explicitly. Caseworkers reviewing active cases sometimes gave undue weight to prior interaction history, specifically to the history of prior cases that had been closed without substantiation, as implicit evidence that current reports might also be unsubstantiated. In practice, this means that every case closed as unsubstantiated quietly functioned as a data point, suggesting the next report was probably also fine. The accumulated history of reports and closures, which should have been read as an escalating pattern of concern, was instead being read case by case, worker by worker, as a history of a family that had been examined many times and found to be acceptable. The more times DCS had looked at this family without finding actionable evidence, the more the absence of prior findings was being used to discount the weight of new findings. The opposite logic, that a family with this many contacts and this many unresolved closures represents an elevated risk, was apparently not being applied with sufficient consistency to override the normalizing effect of accumulated non-findings. State Senator Karen Werner introduced legislation specifically targeting DCS hotline intake reform following Rebekah's death. The bill focused on improving how initial reports are received, documented, and escalated, addressing the first systemic failure the department identified in its own review. Werner was not alone. Arizona lawmakers from both parties escalated their oversight inquiries into DCS operations throughout the fall and winter of 2025, with hearings, public statements, and legislative proposals accumulating across multiple months. By February 2026, Fox 10 Phoenix reported that those reform efforts were still actively moving through the legislature, with lawmakers using language that was neither diplomatic nor hedged. The system is broken, they said. It had to change. The specific phrase, "the system is broken," became something of an unofficial verdict on what happened to Rebekah Baptiste, spoken by legislators, family members, advocates, and journalists in the months following her death. It is worth interrogating what that phrase actually means when applied to a child welfare system, because broken does not mean absent. Arizona's DCS is not a system that does nothing. It employs thousands of workers. It manages tens of thousands of cases. It processes an enormous volume of reports every year. The system was not broken in the sense that it failed to exist. It was broken in the sense that it existed in a form that was structurally inadequate to the task it was charged with performing. Too few workers managing too many cases with too little coordination between the agencies they depend on for context, in a legal framework that presumes family reunification and places enormous burdens of proof on investigators who are trying to establish that a parent is dangerous when the parent is skilled at being cooperative during visits and the child has been trained to recant. That is not a broken machine in the simple sense. It is a machine built to certain specifications that turn out to be insufficient for the real conditions under which it has to operate. Rebekah's mother, Sandy Hawkins, filed a civil lawsuit against the Arizona Department of Child Safety alleging gross negligence resulting in death. The lawsuit centers on the department's handling of the accumulated contacts, and particularly on the October 2024 case closure, the moment when Rebekah had done every right thing a child can do, and the system responded by accepting the abuser's account over hers as causally linked to Rebekah's death. A notice of claim filed as part of that legal process alleged that DCS had failed to properly classify reports, failed to remove the children from the home despite the accumulating record, and failed to act on the documented evidence of ongoing abuse with sufficient urgency at multiple points across multiple years. The civil lawsuit does not have the same threshold of proof as a criminal trial. It does not require establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that DCS workers made specific decisions that directly led to Rebekah's death. It requires establishing that the department failed in its duty of care. Based on everything that is now publicly documented, the 19 contacts, the October 2024 closure, The May 2025 investigation that was opened and then sat unanswered because the family could not be located. That is a case that has considerable evidence behind it. There is a name that comes up every time a conversation about child welfare system failure reaches its most painful register. Gabriel Fernandez. He was 8 years old. He lived in Palmdale, California. He was tortured and murdered by his mother and her boyfriend in 2013, and his case had a contact history with the child welfare system that, in its broad outlines, is devastatingly familiar to anyone who has followed Rebekah's story. His teachers reported. Social workers visited. Case files were opened and managed and closed. The abuse continued. It escalated. Gabriel died in May 2013 after suffering injuries over a sustained period that included burns, broken bones, missing teeth, and a fractured skull. The social workers who had managed his case were criminally charged. The first time in California history that social workers faced criminal prosecution in connection with a child welfare case, though those charges were ultimately dismissed on appeal. Gabriel's case became the subject of a Netflix documentary, legislation, and a national conversation about whether child welfare systems across the country had the structural capacity to protect children they had identified as being at risk. That conversation produced some reforms. It did not produce the kind of fundamental structural change that would prevent what happened to Rebekah Baptiste from happening 12 years later, in a different state, under conditions that are different in their specifics and nearly identical in their mechanism. The mechanism is this: a child lives in a dangerous home. The danger is observed. Reports are made. The system receives those reports and processes them through a series of steps that are designed to balance the goal of child safety against the legal presumption of family preservation and the practical constraints of an underfunded, understaffed, overburdened agency. At each step, the adults who are supposed to protect the child encounter barriers of evidence, of legal authority, of agency coordination, of workload, of the parent's ability to perform cooperatively during visits and teach the children to recant. And the child, who has no power over any of those barriers, continues to live inside the danger while the system processes its way through the protocol. Gabriel Fernandez's case is a landmark because it was the first time the system was held criminally accountable for that process failing. Rebekah Baptiste's case may not produce criminal charges against DCS workers. Nothing in the current public record suggests that is where the civil or criminal proceedings are headed. But it has produced an internal review that confirmed systemic failure at 5 separate levels: a governor-ordered investigation, bipartisan legislative reform efforts, and a civil lawsuit that names the department as a defendant. What distinguishes Rebekah's case in the broader landscape of child welfare failure is not just the severity of what was done to her, though that was severe, or the number of reports that preceded her death, though that number is staggering. It is the October 2024 window escape. It is the specific, documented moment when a 9-year-old child jumped from a second-story building, ran barefoot through a city street asking strangers for help, found a gas station, told the clerk exactly what was happening to her, was taken to a hospital, told police officers the same thing with the same specificity, had her injuries documented as consistent with her account, and was returned to her abusers because her abusers said she had done it to herself. That moment is not ambiguous. It is not a case where the evidence was thin, where the reports were vague, where investigators had no clear indicator of what was happening. It was a child using every tool available to her to produce an unmistakable signal, and the signal was intercepted and neutralized by the very people it was a signal about. If anything meaningful comes out of Rebekah Baptiste's death, and meaningful things have a responsibility to come out of it, because her death demands more than grief and outrage that fades when the news cycle moves on, it has to be a reckoning with that specific moment, with what it means that the protocols in place in November 2024 produced a case closure as their response to a child who had jumped from a window. With what has to change in the way hotline reports are assessed, the way abusers' denials are weighted against children's disclosures, the way prior case history is interpreted when it is long, and the way the legal gap around non-parent household members is addressed, so that the next Anicia Woods cannot decline to participate in services and watch investigations focus elsewhere. Those are policy questions. They have policy answers. The answers are not simple and they are not cheap, and they require political will that is difficult to sustain past the immediate crisis. But they exist, and the people who are working on them, the legislators, the advocates, the researchers, the child welfare professionals who have spent years identifying what needs to change, deserve to have the full weight of Rebekah's story behind them. Not just the horror of her death, but the specific, documented, verifiable chain of events that produced it. Because the specific chain is what tells you where the links are weak, and where the links are weak is where the work has to happen. A memorial service was held for Rebekah Baptiste at Empower College Prep, the school she had attended in Phoenix. It was attended by the people who had known her as a person, not as a statistic, not as a cautionary policy illustration, not as a name in a government report, but as a specific child who had walked through those school doors and sat in those classrooms and been known by the adults who worked there. Her teachers Penny Roubison and Phoenicia Swally spoke. Her grandmother Sandra Hawkins was there. These were the people who had worried about Rebekah, who had reported their concerns, who had tried within the limits of their roles to make the right things happen, and who now had to stand up in a room and speak about her in the past tense. What the teachers and social workers at Empower College Prep carried after Rebekah died was a particular kind of grief that is specific to people who tried and were not enough, not because they didn't try hard enough or care deeply enough, but because the system that was supposed to take what they were trying to hand it and act on it failed to do so. They made 12 calls. The calls went in. Investigations were opened. Cases were closed. And then Rebekah came back to school with marks on her body, and they documented it, and they called again, 12 times, and they had to stand up at a memorial service and look at the people who loved her and speak. There is no clean emotional resolution available for that. There is no version of that experience that does not follow you. Those teachers, those social workers, those staff members, they carry Rebekah with them in the specific, complicated way that people carry things they tried to stop and couldn't. Rebekah's mother, Sandy Hawkins, filed her civil lawsuit and has continued to speak publicly about her daughter. She has given interviews. She has made statements. She has refused to let the story become background noise. The lawsuit she filed is not just a legal action. It is an assertion, made in the most formal and public way available to her, that what happened to Rebekah was not simply a tragedy. It was a failure. Failures have causes, and causes can be identified, and systems can be changed, and people in positions of responsibility can be held to account for not changing them when they had the evidence and the opportunity to do so. That is the argument Sandy Hawkins is making. It is an argument backed by a decade of documentation, and it deserves to be heard by the courts, by the legislature, and by anyone who has the power to make the next outcome different. The trial of Richard Baptiste and Anicia Woods is scheduled to begin on June 2, 2026. Both defendants have pleaded not guilty to all charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, child abuse, and molestation of a child. Both remain in custody with bail set at $1 million each. The evidence the prosecution has assembled, 95 exhibits presented at the preliminary hearing, more than 100 pages of medical documentation, the admissions both defendants made in their own interviews, the testimony of a physician who used the word torture to describe what he found, the statements of the younger brothers, the physical evidence from the campsite, the prior documented history stretching back a decade, is by any measure a substantial case. The defense, at this stage of the proceedings, has not advanced a public alternative theory of the evidence. A jury will hear what happened to Rebekah in a courtroom and decide how to name it under the law. What a jury decides will matter. It will matter to Sandy Hawkins and Sandra Hawkins and every person who loved Rebekah. It will matter as a formal statement by the legal system about the culpability of the two people who are charged with killing her. But the verdict, whatever it is, will not answer all the questions that Rebekah's death has made it necessary to answer. It will not tell DCS which of its workers made which specific decisions and why. It will not determine whether the October 2024 case closure was the product of individual error, systemic pressure, institutional inadequacy, or some combination of all three. It will not mandate that the legislature pass the reforms that Senator Werner proposed, or that the other bills introduced in response to Rebekah's death become law. The criminal trial exists to address the conduct of Richard Baptiste and Anicia Woods. The other accountabilities to the system, to the structures, to the laws and the funding and the protocols that shape the environment in which this happened, are being pursued in other arenas, on longer timelines, with less clarity and less certainty of outcome. Those other arenas are where the longer fight lies: the civil lawsuit, the legislative process, the ongoing journalism, the DCS review and its follow-on commitments, the conversations happening among child welfare professionals and academics and advocates about what meaningful reform of a system this structurally compromised actually requires. These are slow, grinding processes that do not have the urgency of a trial or the emotional resolution of a verdict. They do not produce a single moment when a gavel comes down and something is named for what it is. They produce incremental change, or they don't, over years and in ways that are difficult to attribute to any single cause. But that is where the difference gets made for the next child. Not in the courtroom that judges what was done to Rebekah, but in the policy rooms and budget hearings and training programs that determine what happens to the child who is right now in a household like hers, with a file like hers, reaching for a system that may or may not be capable of reaching back. Rebekah Baptiste deserved a completely ordinary life. She deserved meals and a safe bed, and a front door she didn't have to jump out of to feel safer than she did inside. She deserved to be a kid, to go to school and come home, and not spend her energy calculating how to survive the adults who were supposed to be protecting her. She deserved a mother who wasn't kept at arm's length from her by a system that placed her with the parent most likely to hurt her. She deserved teachers who reported their concerns, and a system that used those reports to actually protect her, not to produce documentation of its own process while she kept going home. She deserved the October 911 call to produce something other than a case closure. She did not get most of those things, but she had teachers who showed up every day and kept trying. She had a grandmother who was there. She had a mother who is still there, still fighting, still making the argument in court and in public that this matters and that something has to change. And she had in herself a particular and extraordinary kind of courage, the courage of a 9-year-old child who jumped from a second-story window barefoot and ran through the street until she found someone with a phone, who tried to leave a desert campsite on July 9, and when that didn't work tried again on July 12, who used every resource available to her across the last year of her life to reach someone who could help. That is not a child who gave up. That is not a child who didn't fight. That is a child who fought with everything she had and ran out of time before the system that owed her its best effort managed to give it. Rebekah Baptiste was 10 years old. She is not a symbol or a statistic or a data point in a policy conversation. She is a child who deserved better than everything she got from the people who were supposed to choose her. And the least this story can do, the least any of us can do from where we are standing, watching from a safe distance, is refuse to let her name be forgotten. Refuse to let this case be filed away when the trial ends and the verdict comes and the news cycle finds its next story. Hold the questions open. Keep asking who failed and how and what is actually going to change. Because the answer to those questions does not just determine what Rebekah's death meant. It determines what happens to the next child in a house like hers. She deserved so much better than this world gave her. Rest in peace, Rebekah. If you are concerned about a child you know, if something feels wrong, if something doesn't look right, if a child has said something that stayed with you, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The number is 1-800-422-4453. You do not have to be certain. You do not need proof. You need only a concern. Rebekah's teachers called 12 times. Your call might be the one that holds. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it. These children deserve to be known by more than the people already mourning them. The more people who know Rebekah's name, the harder it becomes for the systems that failed her to quietly move on. See you next time.